Deploying Backstage on Kubernetes can be a little bit challenging. Backstage is not built to run on Kubernetes out of the box, and we need to do some tricks in order to configure it and make it run. And at the end of the session, each one of us would get Backstage running on its own Kubernetes cluster with the Kubernetes plugin in it. Let's go! Before we are starting the workshop, what we need is two things. One is access to some Kubernetes cluster. I'm using kind cluster that it spun up just before the session. I'm going to use k command instead of writing kubectl, and I have access to this cluster. What you can see on the right side is this GitHub README file, which is an open source repo which have a lot of tutorials on how to deploy different tools. In here we have how to deploy Backstage, and during this workshop, those are going to be the instructions. I'm going to add the link to this GitHub repo to the description below, and you can run any command I do with me at the same time. So what we are going to do first is basically to fork Backstage into our own GitHub user, or to use Backstage repo itself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my project, git clone this repository into Backstage workshop. If you want, you can fork it on your own. That would be highly recommended. So Backstage is a pretty big project. It will take a while. Let's go back after the cloning is done. After you're done with the cloning, for me it took almost 15 minutes. It takes like forever. Then we can start to move forward with the workshop guide. So we are going to cd into the Backstage workshop directory. And something that is optional is actually to check out to the latest version. At the time that I've created this guide, this is the latest version. I like to check out it because I know that it last verified and have all the tests gone. So I'm using it, and now we are on version 1.13.2. Okay. And now we need to have some tools installed in our workstation in order to build Backstage and Backstage Docker image. So the first thing that we are going to use and install is NVM. And NVM allows you to create a virtual node environment. It's already installed on my environment. Sometimes you need to restore the terminal node to make it run. And now we are going to use NVM version. Cool. So we got version 18.16.0 installed. What we need is also to make, basically to install it. If you got it installed, this run will do nothing, but maybe for you it will do something. Oh yeah, we have a new version. 18.16.1. There you go. And now we need to configure NVM to actually use this command. So we are going to copy the NVM use 18. Cool. And now I'm going to make version 18 the default NVM version. Okay, that's it. It changed to 18.16.1. The next tool that we are going to install is Yarn. You may have Yarn, but something special about Backstage, it does require Yarn version 1. So what we are going to do is we are going to set the version to 1 using this command. This is the latest version while I'm creating this guide. Cool, we can see it changed some files. And we are going to verify the version. Cool, so now we are using Yarn version 1. If you're using Mac x86, you may need to update your Xcode select. I'm using the Mac M1 in this tutorial. So I'm not going to do this command, but it's optional for you. The next thing we are going to do is actually to create our own Backstage application. So in Backstage, what we have in here is all the source file for the core capabilities, the components, but what we need next is actually to create our own Backstage application. And from our own Backstage application, we are going to build a Backstage and run it. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create the Backstage application using the npx command. We need to install a package, which is cool. Let's make it run. And now we need to select a name for our own Backstage application. So let's call it Backstage Workshop. And now what's going to happen is that Yarn is going to install and create our own application. Let's wait for a few more minutes. After the application installation is done and the Yarn install took a while, we can see that everything is set up. What it means is that we can actually go and cd to our own application. And if we click on L, we can see that we have some file like the application configuration file, local, production, and general, Backstage JSON, examples, packages, plugins, everything that we need in order to run our own Backstage application is in here. And basically, this is the directory that we are going to work on from now and on. If you want to test that actually everything works and everything cloned perfectly, we can take the yarn dev command on the right side and actually use it. What it's going to do is that it's going to start a new Backstage application. We can see that it opens the browser on the localhost. And we got Backstage up and running. It can take a while. And now we got my company catalog, APIs, everything is in here. You can actually browse and see the connections. It means that we have a healthy Backstage application. If we want, let's open VS Code. Let me make it a little bit smaller. If we want, we can even go to the app config and change the name of the Backstage app. And run it back again. And we can see that we changed the title from whatever it was to Workshop Backstage Catalog, which is nice. Then you can actually tweak and change the application configuration of Backstage to whatever you like it to be. We don't need basically anything in order to change anything in order to make this workshop run. What we want to do is after we have yarn dev running, we want to actually register this component. So what we have in here is click to register an existing component. If we click on it, we will move into this UI. You can also go into it from Home, Create, Register Existing Component. And what we want is now to provide Backstage. We want to load a component from our Git repository into Backstage as an example to how the catalog can look like. So let's paste it in here, sorry. You can have it from here as import component using this file, or it's also available to you from this right side. So we just copy paste it in here. It's going to analyze, make sure it got access to it. Now we are going to import it. And going back on, we can see that the Backstage application was added to our Backstage catalog. When we click on it, we have information about Backstage, website, storybook, documentation, Discord chat if we want to join to, etc., etc. And in this way, you can add as many components as you want into your production Backstage environment. Because this is a dev environment, anytime we are going to close it from run, all the database is going to be deleted. So now we understand that we have Backstage up and running, we configure the application. What we want to do next is basically run Backstage on Kubernetes. To run Backstage on Kubernetes, what we need is first of all to build a container image. So we are going to click in here, frozen log file, do the yarn install, yarn tc. And now we can basically build the backend. And what's going to happen is that Yarn is going to build the backend. It's not going to build the image, it's going to actually build the bundled package for us to pack in the image itself. You can see that it's run pretty fast. And now what we want to do is basically build our own image. So let's copy the Docker image build, paste it in here. Before we are moving on, what I wanted to show you is how you can learn about how to deploy and how to do that. So in the Backstage documentation, you have this building a Docker image, and here you have all the information about building the images with the Docker file in it. Obviously, what you can do is you can run and read basically all the information in here and then move to Kubernetes, and actually in here you got some a lot of files that you need to deploy, or you can use the guide. So I will add documentation links into the description of this video, but to be honest, I think that here in the GitHub repo you have everything you need in order to make it run. So now you have the Docker image built. And we do need to upload the image to our registry because we are using kind cluster. And if you need more information about how to run kind on your own desktop, you can also go to the same repo basically. How to DevOps tools, go to Kubernetes, clusters for local development, kind. And you have the information in here about how to install kind on a single node, multi-node, and you have pre-made configuration file for your own. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to load the image into the kind cluster. So what it does is actually go to the single node in this cluster and going to push the image into the registry. And then when we are going to run our deployment, it's going to fetch the image from the local registry on the node itself. My camera battery died during the load. So as I've loaded the image to my kind cluster, what you need to do is to upload it to any registry that is accessible for your own cluster. It can be local, Minikube one. It really doesn't matter, maybe public registry, Docker Hub, it doesn't matter which registry, just as long as it's accessible. And maybe you need to change the image to reference to this registry. I want to show you that in the documentation of Backstage, you can actually read everything about building the Docker image. You have all the commands, the Docker file example. Everything is available as long as the Kubernetes configuration and all the files and what you need to do. I think the guide that I made is much simpler, so we're going to use this one. The next thing is that we are going to create the Backstage repo, and before that I cloned this repo, the auth tools, which I'm going to also add a link in the description because I've actually packed all the resources you need in order to run Backstage in here. So I cloned the repo, I moved to the Backstage, I changed my directory to the Backstage, and now I'm going to create Backstage and I'm going to deploy Postgres. It's going to create all the volume and the deployment. We can do kubectl get pods -n Backstage. We can see it's running and healthy. You can also run a test. Copy this command to get the pod name and to connect to it if you want. And actually, now it means that the Postgres is up and running. Okay. The next thing we want to do is actually deploy Backstage on Kubernetes. This is the most exciting thing to do in here. To create the Backstage resources, we can also go in here and actually, as I showed you, fetch all the information from that part. But what we are going to do is actually just apply the Backstage resources from the repo. Before we are doing that, we want to have our own GitHub API token. Why is that so important? Because Backstage need API token from GitHub in order to access the software catalog. So what we are going to do is we are going to generate a new API key. It can be done using the guide that's available from here, token scopes. You can find all the permission required for it to run. How do you do that? You're going into your profile, settings. At the bottom, you got developer settings, personal access token, and then click on the token classic and generate your own token. The next thing you need to do is actually encode it in base 64. Or you can use the one deployed in the example. Let's give it a try because I think it's the one from the example from the website. You can find it in here, GitHub token. Let's try to use this one. If it's not going to work, I'm going to change it to my own one. Cool, so let's go back to the repo, back again. Let's go to Backstage, deploy Backstage on Kubernetes and apply all the manifest together. Cool, and now it's going to create a deployment, the service, the secret. And if we are going to do kubectl get pod -n Backstage, we are going to have it. Something that I've added and you cannot find it in the section of deploying Kubernetes is everything related to the service account and the cluster role binding. We do need it in order to activate the Kubernetes integration. So if you don't have Kubernetes integration, this is the plugin, this is the way to deploy it and get access from the pod to the Kubernetes API inside the cluster. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is actually access our brand new Backstage that we just deployed. So we are going to copy this port forward command, paste it in here, and we are going to access to port 8080. Woo! And now we got Backstage up and running on our cluster. It can be local one, remote one, but this is the Backstage that we have. We can go back to home, create and register our own application like we did before. Okay, that's a problem. It means that we don't have permission to actually access the registry. So I'm going to, as I showed you before, get the token, put it inside, apply the secrets, and we are going back in here in a few minutes. It will be a seconds for you. with access to the repo. So what I've did, I just generated an API key as I showed you before. Go in here, developer settings. At the bottom you got secret codes, and then you need to create a classic token based on the permission in the instruction in here. What I'm going to do next is that I'm going to apply the Backstage resources, and then we can see that the new secret actually configured. Let's delete the running code. And instead of the old pod that I'm just going to be deleted, a new one should spawn with the new secret. And obviously in the new secret, what we're going to have is access to the GitHub repo. So now the old pod is terminating. Only after it's terminated, we will get the prompt back. Then we are going to do the port forward back again. Access to the repo, create, register the new component. And now we see that we have access to GitHub. At the same point previously, what happened is we got 414 error, HTTP error code. And now we have imported the Backstage application into the Backstage our Backstage application. Okay, so now we got Backstage up and running with Postgres production environment or production gear environment. But what we want to do next is to connect it to a Kubernetes plugin. And in order to connect it to Kubernetes plugin, we are going to do some work. What it means, we need to follow the documentation explained in here. Let me even open it on a different browser. Okay. So what we're going to do is, as you see in here, actually installing Kubernetes plugin, it's not very easy. Why? You need to install an application like using yarn, install the package, not the application, install a package on the application of the Kubernetes plugin. We need to actually edit some files to get it to the front end, to the back end, and only after that we can configure it. So the first stage is going to install the front-end plugin. So we are going back to the Backstage repository, as we have in here, Backstage workshop, and we are going to install Kubernetes plugin. It can take a while, and what it's going to do is actually put all the relevant files in the relevant places. Let's wait for it to be done. We are going to install the front end and the back end right after the other, and then we are going to edit the files together. So after I did the yarn, this yarn command, I'm going to the backend command and install it. Cool, it should be pretty quick, both of the installation, and then we are going to edit some files. Cool, both of them done with successful exit code. And now we are going back to our VS Code, and we are going to edit the relevant files. So let's do that. The first file that we are going to edit is packages, app, source, components, catalog, entity page. So packages, apps. Okay. What it means is that in here we have how each one of the entities look like. We are going to look for the import Kubernetes entity. It can be added in here, for example. And we are going to add the entity to the relevant route. So service entity page. Okay, and then we can see all the entity page, / CI/CD, APIs. Let's add it just after the APIs, which is pretty good place. The refresh interval is pretty long, but it's fine. Okay, so now we have added it to the front end, and now we need also to add it to the back end. How we are going to add it to the back end? We are going to the same route, packages, not app. App is the front end. Source, plugins, and now we see that we don't have the Kubernetes TS, so we are going to create it. Create new file, Kubernetes TypeScript, and then we are going to copy paste all the content of the file in here. Cool. The last thing is that we want to have to open the access. So we are going back to the source, and now we're going to the index. And in the index file, we are going to import the plugin that we have just added. So let's add the plugin in here. Let's go to the main function. Add the Kubernetes environment as a const in here, and add it to the API router as well. Cool. So this is all the editing that we need to do in the files. So as you see, adding the Kubernetes plugin is not as simple as it seems. The custom cluster discovery is something that we are not going to do because we are going to configure it a little bit different. So now let's go back to our guide after we are done with the installation of the plugin. So in order to activate it, we need to edit our app-config YAML file and add the Kubernetes plugin configuration. So going back to VS Code, in the root directory of our application, we have the app-config file, and we can add it to any place that we want. Let's add it to the end. What it's going to add, it's going to locate the clusters based on the configuration. We are going to use the local cluster that the pod is run on, and we are going to use the service account that we pre-deployed in our Backstage resources file. Oh, sorry. Cool, and basically that's it. Now what we need to do is build. So we are going to build. You can use, it's pretty funny, but you can use build backend only or build all, by the way. It's going to build both of them. And obviously we are going to build the Docker image once again. After we build the image, we are going to load it. So I'm going to be a little bit lazy, and I'm going to use the same tag as before. Let's look for the kind load command. So I'm going to use the same Backstage image and tag, and I'm going to just restart one of the pods. So let's wait for it to be loaded. What we are going to do next, right after Backstage is going to run with our new Kubernetes plugin, we are going to deploy our application, and then we are going to see how Kubernetes plugin identify our application. So let's wait for load to be ended. It's going to be a very basic sample application, and we are going to register it as a component into our Backstage. You can also find an example. At the end of the guide, you can find out to deploy it on GKE. It's a little bit different. We need to do some of the tricks, especially around volumes creation and path in the volume. All the other guide is really relevant to Minikube and kind clusters. Now that we have our image, we can delete our pod. And you have like two options in here. One is actually to deploy the first application on Kubernetes like we have in the guide. The other option is take a look on the Kubernetes plugin and make sure that we actually deployed it as we expected. Kubernetes plugin and the editing that we did to the source file can be a little bit dangerous, and obviously we want to make sure that everything is perfectly running before we are going to deploy our application. So we are going to use the port forward. We don't need this to be open. Okay, so now we got it up and running. Let's use this application. It doesn't have anything in it, which is not good. But maybe it's only this application. So what I'm going to do next is to deploy our own application. So I'm going back to the auth repo, and I'm going to deploy this example application. Okay, we have like two files in here, the deployment created, and the other file is the component, which is not a Kubernetes native resource. This is why it cannot be created. That's fine. What we are going to do next is we are going back to our application, and we want to load our component file. So in here we have user API component, which is, it looks like a Kubernetes resource, but what is actually a Backstage component YAML file. And we are going to take this YAML, and we are going to, so we need to activate the port forward back again. We're going to click on create, register existing application, and then run it. We're going to import, it's only one component, but this is our application component. And now where we are going back, we can see that we have a full-fledged component added to our system. Let's click on it, and now we have the source file of it, who owns it, what is the public website. I also added some dashboard and links to it, and here I can find all the relevant tabs. The CI/CD tab, which is empty because we didn't configure it, the API, if we want, we can add, but more important is the Kubernetes tab. It means that we actually installed our Kubernetes plugin successfully. And what is more exciting about that is that in our cluster, we can see local cluster, one pod is running. We can click on it. This is our deployment that is part of our application. And if we click on it as well, we can see all the pods that are running. We don't have metrics installed, but we can see it's ready. And if we click on the pods, then we have all the relevant information about the pod, what if it's ready or not, how many restarts it had, how long it's running, etc., etc. We can also fetch the logs if we want. So basically, we can access a lot of Kubernetes information from our Kubernetes plugin. And woo! It means that you deployed and I deployed during the workshop Backstage from nothing. We just cloned the repo. We actually created the application, configured the application, installed Kubernetes plugin, build it once again, and then we deploy it. And now we have Kubernetes plugin up and running in our Backstage deployment. Just thank you very much for joining me. For me, it was very useful, insightful session, even to just prepare it for you. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And thank you very much for watching.